There are places on this earth that seem to breathe secrets, places where silence feels heavier than stone, and shadows stretch too far, as though they remember something we have forgotten. One of those places lies hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains, in a valley cut away from the world. For decades, it has been known by a single name, spoken quietly among soldiers, locals, and those who study the unexplained: Ravenwood. Officially, Ravenwood was nothing remarkable, an old U.S. military installation, built during the Second World War and later abandoned when newer facilities rendered it obsolete. That was the story printed in newspapers, whispered at local diners, and buried in dusty county records. But the people who lived in the small towns nearby, the hunters and loggers who worked the forests, and the families who had called the mountains home for generations, they told a different story. They spoke of nights when the sky over Ravenwood glowed with a pale, unnatural light, of low, vibrating hums that rolled down through the valleys, rattling windows and shaking barn doors, of hikers who vanished after straying too close to the perimeter fence, and of soldiers, young men stationed at the facility, who were sent away in the dead of night and never heard from again. The rumors began long before the base was decommissioned. They began the very day construction crews first set foot on the land. Long before there was a military base, the valley had a reputation. Old-timers called it the hollow that doesn't sleep. Native tribes avoided it, telling stories of star spirits who would descend into the forests and lure hunters away. Their voices soft and melodic, promising warmth and firelight, before vanishing into nothing, leaving only silence and cold. In the late 1800s, settlers tried to build farms in the valley. For a while, they endured, but diaries recovered from those early families tell of strange occurrences. Animals refusing to graze near certain patches of ground, children waking at night to point at tall men with shining eyes outside their windows, and fires that would not stay lit, as though an unseen hand snuffed them out. One entry, dated October 12, 1894, reads simply, "They are in the trees again. I hear the humming. I will not go outside. If I do, I will not return." Within 2 months, that family's cabin was empty. Neighbors found the livestock wandering freely, doors wide open, food still on the table, but not a trace of the family themselves. When the U.S. military announced in the 1940s that they had purchased the valley to build a new radar and communications station, the locals exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't protest. They knew better than to argue with government men. But privately, many said the same thing. The Army had chosen the worst possible place. Construction crews reported issues from the beginning. Equipment malfunctioned for no reason. Survey markers would disappear overnight, only to be found stacked neatly in piles miles away. Workers swore they heard voices carried on the wind, though no one else was around. One foreman later claimed that his men refused to work past sundown. "The trees," he said, "change at night. They don't look the same." By the time the facility was completed in 1943, Ravenwood had already built itself a reputation. Soldiers arriving for duty often joked about it at first. They laughed at the strange warnings painted on bathroom walls, the crude carvings left in bunk beds. "Don't walk alone after dark. If you hear the humming, hide. The hollow takes what it wants." But the laughter never lasted long, because sooner or later, every man stationed there experienced something he could not explain. The most common were the lights. Some nights, guards on the watchtowers would see glowing spheres floating silently above the treetops. They would drift in strange patterns, sometimes vanishing in an instant, other times weaving together like fireflies before shooting straight upward into the sky. Searchlights revealed nothing. Radar picked up nothing. Yet the men swore the lights were real. A retired soldier, interviewed decades later, described one such night in 1952. He said, "It was like watching lanterns, but no flame. 3 of them, red and white, weaving around each other. Then they stopped, dead still in the air, like they were staring at us. We all just froze. Then, without warning, they shot off. Not sideways, not down, straight up, gone in a second. No noise, no trail, just gone." Word of such sightings spread quickly through the barracks. Some men were shaken. Others dismissed them as nerves, tricks of light. But then came the disappearances. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, there were stories of soldiers who vanished from Ravenwood. Official reports stated they were transferred to other posts, but their friends swore otherwise. One young corporal supposedly walked out on night patrol and never returned. His flashlight and rifle were found lying in the dirt, the beams still on, but no footprints led away. Another man vanished during kitchen duty. He was scrubbing pans when his fellow cooks stepped outside for a smoke. When they returned minutes later, the sink was still running, the rag floating in the water, but the soldier was gone. No one ever saw him again. The official word was always the same: reassignment. But among the men who lived and served there, the whispers were different. They said Ravenwood took him. For the townsfolk who lived near Ravenwood, the strangeness was not confined to the base. Farmers began finding livestock mutilated in ways too precise for wolves or bears. Entire herds would panic at unseen forces, stampeding until they broke fences and scattered into the woods. One farmer swore he saw something move across his pasture in the moonlight. Tall, thin, silent, with eyes that glowed like coals. He sold his land within the month and never returned. Children, too, whispered of the Watchers. Strange figures they glimpsed in the forest, always just at the edge of sight. One girl, only 10 years old, claimed that a man of silver stood outside her window one night, tapping softly on the glass. She screamed, and her father came running, but by the time he looked outside, there was only darkness. By the 1970s, Ravenwood had earned its place in the folklore of the mountains. Hunters gave the valley wide berth. Locals would not drive past the access road after sundown, but soldiers kept arriving, and with them came more rumors, more whispered warnings. It was in those years, the late 70s and early 80s, that the most chilling accounts began to surface. Tales not only of strange lights or vanished men, but of encounters, direct confrontations with something unearthly, something that did not belong on this earth. But those stories will come later. For now, remember this: every legend begins with whispers, and the whispers around Ravenwood were never about ghosts, or witches, or demons. They were always about visitors, something from above, something watching, something waiting, and in time, something that came closer than anyone at Ravenwood was prepared to face. It began, as these things often do, with a single leak. Not a whistleblowing confession shouted from a rooftop, not a press conference where some gray-haired colonel admitted what he had seen. No, it was smaller, stranger, a photograph, or at least what looked like one. It appeared in late 2021, buried in a forum most people had never heard of. The site itself was half forgotten, a relic of the early internet, filled with long-winded conspiracy threads and blurry UFO photos no one took seriously anymore. But this photograph was different. It showed a wide, barren corridor made of concrete, lit by sickly fluorescent tubes. The kind of corridor you'd expect to find in a bunker or the service wing of a government facility. Nothing remarkable at first glance. Except, at the far end of the hallway, half in shadow, was a shape. It was upright, tall, thin, not quite human. The pixels blurred when zoomed in, but still, something in its posture was wrong. Its arms were too long. Its head sat too high. The faint reflection of its skin, if it could be called skin, gleamed like wet stone. The photo would have been dismissed like every other internet hoax, except for one thing: the metadata. The digital fingerprint embedded in the image. Analysts noticed it immediately. It hadn't been tampered with. The file originated from a military server, a very old one. The date stamp, 1978. The thread was deleted within hours. The account that posted it vanished. And yet, as always, the internet is a sieve. Copies spread. Within days, it had reached journalists, podcasters, even a few senators who, behind closed doors, were already whispering about unexplained aerial phenomena. And then, the press conferences began. The Pentagon rarely does anything spontaneously. Every statement is calculated, every pause rehearsed. That's why the sudden scheduling of a closed-door briefing in December 2021 raised eyebrows. Officially, the briefing concerned emerging aerospace threats. But those who attended, senators, defense staffers, aides, left pale and tight-lipped. One aide, speaking off record, described the atmosphere inside the room. They didn't show us aliens. They didn't show us flying saucers. But the tone, the urgency, was like nothing I've ever seen. You could feel it. Something has them spooked. Shortly after, the Pentagon made a rare public statement. They admitted, hesitantly, that objects of unknown origin had indeed been tracked in U.S. airspace. They admitted these objects displayed flight capabilities beyond any known aircraft. But when pressed for details, locations, recovered materials, historical incidents, the officials clammed up. No comment. Classified. Not in the public interest. The silence was deafening. That silence was familiar to a handful of men and women who had lived through something they'd never dared to speak about. For decades, they'd buried their memories under routine, under the weight of ordinary life. But as the Pentagon danced around its half-truths, those memories stirred. One of them was a retired radar operator living quietly in Ohio. His name was redacted in the leaked interview transcripts, but his voice trembled with age and memory. We were told it was a drill, just a drill. But radar doesn't lie. It was moving at impossible speeds, stopping dead, starting again. Nothing I'd ever seen. And when they scrambled us out there, into those woods, I knew it wasn't a drill. Another came from a nurse, long retired, who had worked at a small base clinic in the Appalachian foothills during the late 1970s. She recalled a night of chaos. Sirens, shouting, armed men flooding the facility. She saw stretchers wheeled past. Her station, covered in tarps. The smell that clung to those tarps, she said, was like burnt copper and rotting meat. These fragments, scattered like broken glass, pointed back to one place. Ravenwood. For years, Ravenwood had been nothing more than a ghost in military records. A handful of declassified maps labeled it as a communications hub. An old budget report listed it as inactive. Nothing to see, nothing to question. But now, with whispers swirling, journalists dug deeper. They found purchase in the cracks. There were references in congressional hearings from the early 1980s, innocuous lines buried in transcripts, phrases like containment protocols, funding for site closure, losses sustained at Ravenwood. None of it explained. None of it followed up. One reporter, a tenacious woman named Laura McConnell, pursued a Freedom of Information Act request. Months later, what she received was almost laughable. A folder full of heavily blacked-out pages, entire paragraphs obscured by thick marker. But among the black bars, one phrase repeated again and again. Incident 1978, Ravenwood Facility. And that was all it took. The name, once buried in dust and silence, was out again. Ravenwood. The public wanted answers. They demanded them. Yet the more pressure mounted, the more the Pentagon deflected. They spoke in riddles, in evasions. A general, when asked directly whether anything had ever been recovered at Ravenwood, chuckled, as though the question itself was absurd. There are always rumors about these places, he said. Most of them come from Hollywood. But beneath the smirk, his hand trembled. That was the thing about Ravenwood. For every denial, there was a shadow. For every dismissal, a fragment surfaced. Locals remembered the booms, the nights when the ground shook as though something massive was tunneling. Below, farmers recalled helicopters circling their fields at 3 a.m, chasing lights that darted away faster than the eye could follow. Hunters spoke of stumbling upon strange metal debris in the woods, debris that vanished the following day, as though someone had swept the forest clean. And then there were the disappearances. Not many, just enough to stain the memory of the place. A pair of hikers in 1979, a teenage boy in 1983, an amateur spelunker who claimed he found a sealed military tunnel in 1985. None returned. When their families asked questions, they were met with silence. Or worse, the knock on the door, the 2 men in black suits, the rehearsed condolences. The more the Pentagon avoided, the deeper the hunger for truth became. Podcasters speculated endlessly. Documentaries with ominous music aired late at night. And through it all, the name Ravenwood grew into something larger, something mythic. It wasn't just a base anymore. It was a wound in the collective imagination, a scar left by something the government desperately wanted forgotten. And yet, silence, no official acknowledgement, no confirmation, no denial. Just the hollow echo of classified rooms and shredded files. It was as though Ravenwood had never existed at all. But people remembered. And in remembering, they began to speak. One winter evening in 2022, a recording surfaced online. The voice was old, raspy, marked with the fatigue of someone carrying a secret for decades. The man identified himself only as Daniel. I worked there, he said. Not for long. Maybe 6 months. I can't tell you my job. I can't even tell you my real name, but I saw things that don't leave your dreams. He paused. The silence stretched. When he spoke again, his voice cracked. They keep saying nothing was recovered. That's a lie. Something was recovered. I watched them bring it in. I watched them roll it down the corridor, and I swear to you, it was still moving. The recording cut off abruptly. Attempts to trace the upload failed. The account vanished within hours, but the damage was done. The silence of Ravenwood was no longer just silence. It was terror. And so, the stage was set. On one side, an official wall of denial. On the other, a flood of whispers, rumors, testimonies, each more unsettling than the last. Between them stood Ravenwood itself, silent, abandoned, watching. The question was no longer if something had happened there. The question was what? And that perhaps was the most chilling silence of all. History has a way of burying its darkest places beneath layers of silence, erasing names and covering over the scars with the calm of time. But Ravenwood was never truly buried. Its silence was not the silence of forgetting. It was the silence of something suppressed, something pushed down deliberately, as though locking a door to keep whatever lived behind it from getting out. To understand the rumors that circle Ravenwood today, you must first understand what it once was. You must peel back the curtain of decades and step into a world where shadows grew in the name of progress, and secrets were laid into the ground like concrete and steel. In the mid-1940s, as the Second World War burned to a close, the United States government turned its gaze inward. The fight overseas had proven one thing above all else. Technology was now the engine of survival. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the war, and so, hidden among rolling ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, a new site was chosen. It was remote. Dense forests cloaked the hills. Old mining towns sat in valleys below, clinging to fading industries. There was little traffic, little oversight, and, most importantly, plenty of land that could vanish from maps without anyone raising questions. The official story was simple. A radar and communications outpost, the kind of installation that could be explained away with military jargon that no civilian would dare argue with. The truth, however, was far more complicated. At first, construction crews poured concrete and steel into the ground, raising blocky utilitarian buildings that looked like every other bus in America. But beneath those dull facades were foundations far deeper than any radar station required. Massive reinforced shafts disappeared into the earth. Freight elevators were installed, though no local contractor ever admitted to supplying them. A honeycomb of corridors began to spread under the forest floor, tunnels large enough to move trucks through. By 1948, Ravenwood had already swallowed more than $40 million, an extraordinary sum for what was supposed to be a listening station. As the Cold War settled like a frost over the world, Ravenwood grew in both size and purpose. Radar arrays were mounted on the ridgelines, their skeleton-like silhouettes looming over the treetops. Locals called them the Black Trees. The town of Fairhaven, a small mining community not far from the base, watched convoys of trucks crawl up the mountain roads, hauling cargo under tarps so heavy the axles groaned. Inside Ravenwood, the story was changing. The base became a laboratory. Its mission broadened from watching the skies to studying them. Scientists arrived, physicists, engineers, doctors. Some were immigrants with heavy accents, their pasts buried as carefully as the base itself. Rumor had it that some were German scientists spirited over after the war, men who had once worked on projects so secret, even Hitler had whispered about them. Strange machinery was installed underground, cyclotrons, pressure chambers, and vast sealed vaults whose purpose no one outside the program could explain. One local contractor recalled glimpsing a steel cylinder 30 feet long, mounted inside a chamber lined with copper coils. When he asked what it was for, the answer was simple: don't ask again. But Ravenwood seemed cursed from its beginning. The first tragedy came in 1949, when a crane collapsed during construction of one of the subterranean shafts. 7 workers were killed instantly, their bodies crushed beneath twisted steel. A newspaper in Fairhaven ran a small headline about an industrial mishap, but the article vanished from the archives within a week. A year later, a convoy truck, carrying equipment up the winding mountain road, skidded off the cliff during a storm. Witnesses claimed the truck never even touched the guardrail. It swerved suddenly, violently, as though something had shoved it from the road. Both men inside were killed. Their families were told they had been drunk. Neither had ever been known to drink. In 1953, a fire broke out deep inside the base. No one in Fairhaven ever saw flames, but for 3 nights, smoke curled over the mountains. A dozen men never came home. Officially, there was no record they'd ever worked there. Whispers began to ripple through the valley. Locals spoke of men disappearing, their names scrubbed from payrolls. Children were told never to wander too far into the woods. At night, strange lights flickered above the ridge, lights that moved too fast, too silently, to belong to any plane. Ravenwood was not just a base. It was a shadow that stretched across the town beneath it. Fairhaven became a community of watchers, bound together by curiosity and fear. Old miners drinking at the bar swore they'd seen convoys carrying cargo that hummed as it passed, as though electricity itself lived inside the crates. Hunters returned pale, describing animal carcasses they found mutilated in the woods, rabbits with skin peeled back like a surgeon's scalpel had cut them, deer lying lifeless with not a drop of blood left inside. And then there were the sounds. Night. When the wind swept down from the mountains, the people of Fairhaven swore they could hear a low vibration, like machinery far underground. Sometimes it rose into a faint, almost human wail, a sound that made dogs whimper and children cry in their sleep. Some dismissed it as imagination, but too many heard it for too long for it to be coincidence. What makes Ravenwood so disturbing is not just what is known, but what has been erased. Maps from the 1940s show the area clearly, with logging roads and survey markers. By the 1960s, entire tracts of land are missing. Military maps label the area only as Restricted Zone 12. Civilian maps simply leave it blank, as though a piece of the earth had been cut away. Archives in Fairhaven tell a similar story. Newspapers that once ran stories about Ravenwood accidents now have missing pages. Photographs of convoys and construction crews are gone. Local families recall sons and fathers who worked at the base. Yet when those families search for proof, there are no records. Birth certificates vanish. Employment rolls are blank. It is as though Ravenwood has been at war not just with secrecy, but with memory itself. Still fragments of the truth escaped. A retired soldier once told his grandson about being stationed at Ravenwood in the early 1960s. He described long nights inside a cavernous hall where a massive object was covered with tarps. Sometimes, late at night, the tarps shifted as though something inside was moving. A nurse who worked in the Fairhaven clinic recalled treating soldiers with burns so severe, their skin sloughed away at the touch, yet their clothing was untouched. When she tried to file reports, her supervisor reminded her of the contract she had signed. She left town a year later and was never heard from again. And then there were the children. Teenagers dared each other to climb the fence at the edge of the woods. Some claimed to see glowing shapes hovering in the distance, their outlines flickering like heat mirages. A boy named Samuel Harlow went missing in 1971. He had gone into the trees with 2 friends. The friends came back screaming, incoherent, saying Samuel had been pulled into the ground. His body was never found. By the late 1970s, Ravenwood was no longer just a base. It was a presence, a shadow in the collective mind of everyone who lived within 20 miles of its fence line. The town of Fairhaven began to die. Businesses closed. Families moved away. Those who remained grew quieter, as though living beneath a weight they could not name. Some said it was the economy. Others said it was something far older, far darker, bleeding down from the mountain. Even now, if you walk the old logging roads, you will find strange scars in the earth. Vents, sealed with rusting grates, where air once roared out of the tunnels below. If you stand very still, some locals say you can still feel warmth rising from them, as though machines deep underground are still alive, still running, still waiting. By the 1980s, Ravenwood was already fading from public maps. Officially, its operations were scaled back. Guards still patrolled the perimeter, but the convoys grew fewer. The radar arrays on the ridge were dismantled, their skeletons left to rot in the weather. But silence does not mean death. Fairhaven residents still whispered of late-night helicopters circling with no lights. They spoke of booms underground that rattled windows, though no earthquakes were ever recorded. Some swore they saw strange men in black suits walking the streets, knocking on doors, asking quiet questions. Ravenwood may have been forgotten by the wider world, but in the valley below, no one forgot, because forgetting was impossible. Forgetting was unsafe. Ravenwood was not just a base. It was a scar carved into the mountain, a scar carved into memory, a scar that never healed. And as history would soon show, scars like that have a way of bleeding again. The gravel crunched beneath the car tires as Emma carefully steered the vehicle up the winding dirt road. Beyond the reach of the headlights, the night pressed in, thick and watchful. The fog that had followed them seemed almost eager now, curling along the edges of the road like pale, skeletal fingers reaching for the car. Lily leaned forward from the back seat, her eyes locked on the dim glow that had begun to emerge ahead of them. A shape was forming through the mist. A structure, not just any structure, but a house, standing alone in a clearing that seemed carved from the darkness itself. Finally, Jake muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence, "Looks like we found somewhere." But no one answered him. They were all staring at the house. It was large, 2 stories, with a wide porch that stretched along its front. Its silhouette suggested a kind of age that went beyond decades, timber beams sagging beneath their own weight, a roofline bent. Like a tired old man, its windows, tall and narrow, were dark except for one. A faint yellow glow pulsed weakly from the upper left window, like a single weary eye watching them approach. Ben exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "This place is wrong." "Wrong or not," Emma said, forcing calm into her tone. "We don't really have a choice, do we? The town was empty. The roads keep looping. It's like this house was waiting for us. Her last words seemed to hang in the air, and none of them dared correct her, because it did feel like that. The car rolled to a stop just outside the front steps. The headlights illuminated the lower half of the house, making the peeling paint glisten like old scars. The fog writhed around the foundation, clinging as though it were part of the building itself. For a long moment, no one moved. Lily broke the silence. It doesn't make sense. Who would live out here? And why is there only one light on? Jake tried to force a laugh, though it came out strained. Maybe they're just night owls. Or maybe, Ben said darkly, they were expecting us. That silenced them again. Finally, Emma opened her door. The air outside was colder than she'd expected, biting her skin like tiny needles. She could smell damp earth and something else, an acrid metallic tang that made her stomach twist. The others followed reluctantly, each door closing with a hollow thunk that echoed too loudly against the trees. The porch loomed before them, its wooden steps warped and groaning beneath their weight. The railing, once painted white, had rotted into gray splinters. A rocking chair sat motionless in the corner, facing the yard, as though it had been left there mid-conversation. Emma reached the door first. It was massive, its surface carved with intricate patterns, spirals, knots, and strange symbols that didn't belong to any style she recognized. Her fingers brushed over them without meaning to, and the wood felt oddly warm. Jake came up beside her. Should we knock? Emma hesitated. Something in her gut screamed that knocking wasn't necessary, that whoever or whatever lived here already knew they had arrived, but she forced herself to rap her knuckles lightly against the wood. The sound echoed, too loudly, as though the house itself swallowed the knock and amplified it from within. Seconds passed. Nothing. And then, with a sound like a sigh, the door creaked open. No one had touched it. The interior was dark, save for the faint glow of a lantern burning somewhere deeper inside. The smell of dust and decay wafted out, carrying with it something else, an undertone of sweetness, like flowers, left too long in stagnant water. Hello? Emma called into the gloom, her voice trembling despite her effort to control it. No reply. Jake took a step inside, his sneakers creaking on the warped floorboards. Look, it's just an old house, probably abandoned. Maybe that light upstairs is just, I don't know, a leftover lamp or something. But even he didn't believe his own words. They filed in cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. The living room stretched before them, vast and shadowy, with ceilings, higher than seemed possible for a house this size. Faded wallpaper peeled away in long strips, revealing dark wood beneath. Furniture sat shrouded in white sheets, their shapes warped like ghosts frozen mid-motion. Lily's eyes darted to the walls. Family portraits lined them, sepia-toned images of stern-faced men and women, their gazes sharp and accusatory even, through decades of fading. One of the frames had fallen crooked, but the eyes in the portrait still seemed to follow her as she moved. This place isn't abandoned, Lily whispered. Emma felt it too. The air itself seemed to breathe, as though the house had lungs hidden in its beams and plaster. From deeper within, the faint sound of creaking floorboards echoed. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone's here, Ben hissed, his fists clenching at his sides. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving silence so heavy it pressed against their ears. Emma swallowed hard. She forced herself to move forward, each step measured, her heartbeat hammering in her throat. She reached the base of the staircase that wound upward into shadow. That was where the lantern glow flickered, faint and beckoning from the second floor. Do we really want to go up there? Jake muttered. But before Emma could answer, a sound rose behind them. The front door slammed shut. All four of them spun around. The heavy door had swung back into place with violent force, the echo reverberating through the hollow rooms. Emma ran to it, grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't budge. She yanked harder, but it was like trying to move stone. "We're trapped," Lily whispered, her face pale in the gloom. The house seemed to groan in response, the beams creaking. Above them, a sound that was not quite natural, as if the building itself had laughed. Emma took a breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Okay, panicking won't help. There's someone upstairs. Maybe they can help us." "Or maybe," Ben said flatly, "they're the reason we're here." No one contradicted him. Slowly the group ascended the staircase. Each step complained beneath their weight, groaning and snapping as though reluctant to carry them higher. The lantern glow grew brighter with each step, flickering shadows along the walls. The wallpaper here was darker, patterned with curling vines that seemed to writhe in the unsteady light. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched long and narrow. Doors lined either side, all closed except for one, the source of the light. Its door stood ajar, the lantern glow spilling out like a crooked smile. Emma led the way, though her legs trembled with each step. She pushed the door open slowly, and it groaned on its hinges. Inside was a bedroom, its air heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. The lantern sat on a small table by the window, its flame guttering weakly. A large four-poster bed dominated the room, its canopy sagging. The blankets were disheveled, as though someone had just risen from them. And on the wall opposite the bed hung a mirror. It was enormous, framed in carved wood that twisted into shapes that might have been vines or might have been serpents. The glass was dark, almost black, and for a moment Emma thought it was shattered. But no. The surface shifted subtly, like ripples moving across water. They all froze, staring at it. Then in the glass, shapes began to appear. Not their own reflections, but figures, distorted, pale, leaning forward as though peering out at them. The figures had no faces, only hollow impressions where features should have been. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "That's not us." The faceless figures raised their hands, pressing them against the inside of the glass. The surface shivered, as though it were nothing more than water. And then slowly, one of the figures began to push through. The glass stretched outward like skin, bulging, distorting. A pale hand broke through the surface, its fingers long and claw-like, dripping with something black. Lily screamed. Emma stumbled backward, her shoulder slamming into the bedpost. The hand grasped at the air, groping for something to pull itself free. Jake grabbed the lantern from the table, lifting it high. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked. The thing in the mirror didn't falter. Its other hand pressed forward, breaking through with a wet sound, followed by the suggestion of a face, smooth, featureless, but somehow hungry. The lantern flame sputtered violently, then flared bright, throwing shadows that seemed to twist and recoil from the light. The faceless figure froze, its hands trembling, before slowly retreating back into the glass. The surface rippled, then stilled, becoming once again a dark, empty reflection. Silence. The only sound was their ragged breathing. Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. We need to get out of this house." "Yeah," Ben said hoarsely. "Now." But when they turned toward the door, they froze. It was closed, and they hadn't heard it shut. The storm had passed, leaving the night unusually calm. The house seemed to exhale after hours of groaning under wind and rain, as though it too had been holding its breath. The walls were damp, the windows streaked with water, and the silence that followed was unnerving, not peaceful, not restful, just empty. Emily lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling beams that stretched like skeletal fingers above her. She had dozed in short, broken fragments of sleep, each one disturbed by sounds she couldn't place. A door hinge creaking, the faint scrape of something against the floorboards, whispers carried in the dark. And though she had forced herself to stay in her room, to remain under the covers like a child hiding from monsters, her mind refused to let her rest. It was nearly 3 a.m. when she finally sat up, her throat dry, her skin clammy. A restless pull gnawed at her, an instinct whispering that something in the house was wrong. She tried to dismiss it as nerves, as exhaustion, but her chest tightened with each second she ignored it. Emily wrapped herself in a shawl, lit the oil lamp, and stepped into the hall. The silence of the house seemed to fold around her, heavier, now that the storm was gone. The smell of damp wood lingered, along with a faint metallic tang, like rust. She moved quietly, her lamp throwing shifting shadows against the walls, elongating the carved details of the wood into grotesque figures. She descended the main staircase slowly, every step groaning under her weight. The banister felt slick, damp from condensation, and she had the uneasy sensation that something was watching her from below. When she reached the main hall, her eyes caught something she hadn't noticed before. A painting. It hung above the fireplace, a large gilt-framed canvas that seemed too grand, too elaborate for a place this forgotten. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. She was certain, absolutely certain, that painting had not been there before. Earlier, when she had first arrived, the mantel above the fireplace had been bare. Dust had coated the wood evenly, without any rectangular outline suggesting something had been removed or hung there recently. Yet now, in the flickering glow of her lamp, a painting loomed in full display. Her hand tightened on the lamp's handle as she stepped closer. It was a portrait, a woman's portrait. The subject sat in a high-backed chair, dressed in dark garments that suggested another century. Her hair was pinned back in an intricate braid, her features delicate yet stern, her lips slightly pursed. But it wasn't the detail of the painting that unsettled Emily. It was the eyes. They were dark, almost black, painted with such skill they seemed alive. And they stared directly at Emily, not past her, not through her, but into her. A cold prickle slid down her spine. She leaned closer, studying the brushstrokes, looking for a signature. But the lower corner of the painting was smeared, as though someone had deliberately obscured the name. Her pulse quickened. The air around the fireplace felt denser, harder to breathe. Emily swallowed hard and whispered into the empty hall, her voice trembling. "You weren't here before." The house offered no reply, only the soft hiss of the oil lamp and the faint crackle of cooling wood. She turned away, forcing herself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe she had overlooked it. Maybe exhaustion had blurred her memory, but no matter how much she tried to convince herself, the certainty pressed into her like a blade. The painting had not been there. As she began to step back, the floor beneath her groaned louder than it should have. She paused, the hair at the nape of her neck rising. The eyes in the painting gleamed. For a moment, they seemed to glisten as if wet, reflecting the lamplight in a way paint should not. Emily's breath caught, her chest tightening. She blinked hard, telling herself it was a trick of light. But when she opened her eyes again, the corners of the painted woman's mouth had curled, just slightly, just enough to form the faintest suggestion of a smile. Emily's lamp trembled in her grip, casting erratic shadows that danced across the hall. Her voice broke into the silence. No, I didn't see that. It's just me, just me. She turned sharply, retreating toward the staircase. Her steps echoed too loudly in the vast hall, the boards beneath her feet betraying every ounce of her panic. She gripped the banister and pulled herself up, forcing her eyes away from the painting, refusing to look back. But as she climbed the stairs, her mind whispered with a horrible certainty. The smile had widened. Her room felt smaller when she returned, as though the walls had drawn closer while she was gone. She shut the door firmly, turned the key in the lock, and pulled the curtains closed, shrouding herself from the night. The lamp on her bedside table flickered, and she pressed her hands together to stop their shaking. She lay back on the bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, trying to focus on her breathing. But sleep refused her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the painting, the woman's eyes, the faint smile curling her lips. Hours crawled by. At some point, she must have drifted into a half-sleep, because she woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps, soft, slow, measured. They came from the hall. Emily sat bolt upright, her pulse thundering in her ears. She strained to listen. The footsteps moved past her door, pausing for a long, unbearable moment just outside. She clutched the covers to her chest, barely daring to breathe. Then, silence. A silence so deep it was louder than sound itself. And then, a knock. One sharp, deliberate knock on her door. Emily bit her lip to stop a scream. The knock didn't come again. Whoever or whatever was there simply stood outside her door, waiting. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to stretch. At last, when courage returned in small fragments, Emily rose from her bed. Barefoot, she crept to the door, pressing her ear against the cold wood. Nothing. No breathing, no shuffling, no sound of retreat. With trembling hands, she slid the key from the lock and twisted the knob slowly. The door creaked open a fraction of an inch. She peered into the hall. It was empty, but something had changed. At the far end of the corridor, just beneath the flickering sconce, hung another painting. Her stomach dropped. It was the same portrait, the same woman, the same piercing eyes. Only this time, the smile was unmistakable, wider, sharper, almost triumphant. Emily's voice cracked as she whispered into the emptiness, "What do you want from me?" The silence swallowed her words whole. And for the first time since she entered the house, Emily felt certain of one thing. Whatever lived here was not confined to the walls or shadows. It moved, it followed, and it watched, always. The storm had moved on, but its presence still lingered in the bones of the earth. The air was damp, filled with a clinging heaviness that pressed against skin and clothes. The four friends sat huddled in the dim light of the abandoned building, the silence between them more deafening than the winds that had howled hours before. The only sound now was the occasional groan of the old structure, wood shifting as if it were breathing. Emma sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her arms locked tightly around them. Her eyes moved constantly, darting from shadow to shadow, as though expecting something to emerge at any moment. Jake was pacing, his boots crunching against the layers of dirt and grit on the floor. Ben leaned against a collapsed beam, eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched tight, and Lily sat with her head lowered, twisting the fabric of her sleeve between her fingers. No one wanted to speak. Words felt dangerous, like giving voice to their fear would somehow make it real. Yet silence was worse. Silence gave the shadows permission to grow bolder, gave the still air the chance to whisper back. It was Emma who finally broke the quiet. "Did you hear it?" she asked, her voice low, trembling. Jake stopped pacing. "Hear what?" "That sound, like something moving in the dust, right outside." Her eyes flicked toward the cracked door, where faint streaks of moonlight had begun to seep through. Lily shook her head quickly, almost violently. "No, don't say that. Don't. We're safe in here. Nothing's out there." But even as she spoke, the room seemed to argue against her. A faint shifting sound carried through the walls, a soft scrape as though something heavy was dragging itself along the dirt. Everyone froze. Ben's hand instinctively went to the rusted crowbar he had found earlier. He gripped it tight, his knuckles pale. "We're not alone," he muttered. Jake walked toward the door slowly, each step loud against the quiet. "Maybe it's just the wind," he offered, but his voice betrayed him, thin and strained. He placed his hand on the edge of the door and pushed it open just enough to peer outside. The night greeted him with a stillness so complete it felt staged. The ground was blanketed in a fine layer of dust, untouched, smooth, glowing faintly under the pale light of the moon. There was no movement, no figure, no sign of anything alive. And yet as Jake squinted into the darkness, he saw it. A pattern in the dust, not footsteps exactly, but trails, as if something had been crawling. The lines twisted and looped in strange formations, too deliberate to be random. They stretched from the edge of the building into the far-off darkness where the moonlight could no longer reach. Jake shut the door quickly, his breathing heavier now. "Something's been here." Emma whimpered softly. "What do you mean?" "Tracks, or marks, like something dragged itself through the dust." He swallowed hard, and it was close. The words clung to the air like a curse. No one spoke after that. The only sound was their breathing, uneven and shallow. It wasn't long before the whispering began. At first it was so faint that Emma thought it was just her mind unraveling from exhaustion. A hiss, delicate as a breath, curling at the edges of her thoughts. But then it grew clearer, like voices carried through walls too thin to hold them back. She looked around quickly. "Did you hear that?" Lily's head snapped up. "Hear what?" "The whispering." Emma's voice cracked. It's coming from outside." Ben shook his head. No, that's not from outside." His voice was grim, low. "That's from here, inside." And now they all heard it. The sound of many voices, overlapping, indistinct. A chorus of murmurs. They couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, insistent, hungry. The four of them pressed closer together, their fear almost tangible, a living thing. The whispers swirled through the building, threading through the cracks in the walls, weaving into the very dust that lay thick on the ground. Jake clenched his fists. "It's this place. It's wrong. It's all wrong." Emma squeezed her eyes. "Shut. Make it stop. Please make it stop." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping until they filled the room like water rising, pressing into ears, burrowing into skulls. Then just as suddenly, they fell silent. The abruptness of it was worse than the sound itself. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, as though the air itself had been stolen away. Ben was the first to move. He pushed himself up and raised the crowbar. "We can't stay here," Jake nodded. "We leave, now." "No," Lily whispered sharply. "What if it's waiting for us out there? What if it's waiting in here?" Ben snapped back. His voice cracked with desperation. They stood in a tense, terrified standoff. The decision clawed at them, heavy with the knowledge that either choice could be fatal. Then, from the corner of the room, came the sound of movement. Slow, deliberate. All heads turned at once. In the farthest shadowed corner of the room, the dust had begun to stir. It shifted as though something invisible moved across it, leaving behind trails identical to the ones Jake had seen outside. The trails spiraled, twisting into shapes that almost resembled letters, words written in dust. Emma's breath caught. "It's trying to talk to us." Ben's grip on the crowbar tightened, his whole body tense. "No, it's playing with us." The dust continued to shift, forming shapes that dissolved and reformed. The friends stood frozen, caught between awe and terror, watching as something unseen wrote its message across the floor. Finally, the shapes settled into a single word. "Leave," the letters held for a moment before collapsing back into the dust. The silence that followed was unbearable. Emma was trembling violently now. "It doesn't want us here." Jake's jaw tightened. "Then we go." No one argued this time. They gathered themselves quickly, fear propelling them faster than thought. Jake pushed the door open again, revealing the cold stretch of dust-covered earth under the moon. The world outside was deathly still, but the trails were there again, longer now, closer to the door, as though something had been circling while they hesitated. Ben raised the crowbar higher, his shoulders squared. "Stay close. Don't look back." They stepped outside, one by one, the dust crunching softly underfoot. The cold night air wrapped around them, sharp and biting, but it felt almost like relief compared to the suffocating whispers inside. Emma clung to Lily's arm, and Jake led the way. As they walked, the dust whispered under their feet, disturbed by every step, and though they tried not to look, each of them noticed the shifting trails on the ground beside them, moving parallel, keeping pace. Unseen, but never far, the whispers didn't follow them into the night. But the silence that replaced it was worse, carrying the promise that whatever had spoken in dust was not gone. It was walking with them. The night pressed on with a weight that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the four friends. None of them spoke as they moved deeper into the mansion, each step echoing with dreadful certainty. Their shoes scuffed across cracked marble, the sound sharp against the suffocating silence. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for them to make a mistake. Emma's flashlight beam flickered briefly, sputtering as if drained by some unseen force. She slapped the side of it with her palm, and the beam steadied, but not before she caught a glimpse of something. A faint ripple at the far end of the hallway, as if the very air itself was bending. Her voice broke the silence, fragile and small. "Did you guys see that?" Jake shook his head quickly, too quickly, his lips pressed tight. It was nothing, just the light. But Lily was already staring down the hallway, her eyes wide, unblinking. "No, it wasn't nothing. The walls, did you see? They shifted." Ben scoffed under his breath, but the sound lacked conviction. Buildings don't just move. You're tired, that's all. Yet as he said the words, the house itself seemed to mock him. The groan of timbers echoed above, followed by a low, grinding noise, like stone dragging against stone. The walls trembled, just slightly, but enough to make the floor vibrate under their feet. Emma's throat went dry. "It's alive," she whispered, so softly she thought no one heard. But Lily turned toward her, eyes brimming with silent agreement. They pressed forward. The hallway stretched ahead endlessly, longer than it had any right to be. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had walked for minutes without reaching the door they could see at the far end. It never seemed to get closer. Ben stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. His breath came hard, clouding the faint beam of his flashlight. "Wait," he said. "Turn around." Confused, the others did. Behind them, the hallway stretched in the opposite direction. And there, too, was a door, identical to the one ahead, as though the corridor itself had mirrored. Jake muttered a curse under his breath. This isn't possible. But it was. The mansion was no longer following the rules of their world. They continued walking, each step echoing louder now, as if the floor beneath them amplified the sound. Every creak seemed deliberate, every shift of wood and stone timed with their movements. And then Emma noticed something that made her blood turn cold, her reflection. On the walls, faint and rippling like water, shadows mimicked their steps. She caught her own outline moving alongside her, but it wasn't right. The figure was slower, its head tilted too far to the side, as though studying her with hungry curiosity. "Stop," Emma hissed, grabbing Lily's wrist. "Look at the walls." The others turned their beams, and the hallway lit up with shapes. 4 shadows, distorted and elongated, followed them. But the movements weren't perfectly synced. Jake's shadow twitched unnaturally, his arm bending at an impossible angle. Ben's figure smiled, a grotesque grin stretching wider than his actual mouth. Lily's shadow lingered behind, dragging itself forward, as though reluctant to keep pace. And Emma's shadow had no eyes. Ben swore loudly, stumbling back, the beam of his flashlight cutting wildly across the walls. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But the shadows reacted to his panic. They shivered, then pressed themselves closer against the wall, as though straining to peel away from it. For a moment, Emma swore she saw her reflection's hand pushing outward, the fingers stretching beyond the flat surface like wet ink sliding across parchment. "Keep moving," Jake barked, his voice breaking with fear. They bolted forward, the hallway echoing with the slam of their feet. Yet the further they ran, the less progress they made. The door loomed ahead, always just out of reach, while the shadows behind them began to slip closer, inching free from the walls. Lily gasped, stumbling to a halt. Her flashlight beam shook violently in her grip. "It's behind us!" They turned, and Emma's stomach dropped. The shadows had broken free. 4 figures now stood in the hallway, their shapes blurred, faces blank, except for twisted mouths, etched into expressions of mockery. They didn't walk. They glided, their forms rippling as though made of smoke and liquid. Emma's knees weakened. "Run," she whispered. So they did. The hallway stretched and warped as they sprinted, the walls closing in, the ceiling pressing lower. Their breaths came ragged, each inhale sharp and painful. Behind them, the doppelgangers slid closer, their movements wrong, disjointed, as though pulled by invisible strings. Jake reached the door first. He threw his shoulder against it, the wood groaning but not giving. "Help me," he yelled. Ben slammed into it next, pounding his fists against the panels. Lily and Emma shoved, their palms raw against the surface, but the door refused to budge. Behind them, the shadow figures slowed, as if savoring their prey. They tilted their heads in unison, mouths stretching into grotesque grins. One raised its arm, and Emma felt her chest tighten, as though invisible hands were closing around her lungs. She gasped, clawing at her throat. "I can't breathe." Lily turned, her face twisted in terror. "They're choking her. Jake, do something." Jake roared in desperation, slamming his shoulder against the door again. This time, something cracked, with a final, desperate shove. The door burst open. They tumbled through, collapsing onto the cold floor of another chamber. Jake swung around and slammed the door shut. The wood rattled violently, shaking under the weight of pounding fists, or something far worse. But it held, for now. Silence filled the room, broken only by their gasps for air. Emma pressed a trembling hand to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. The invisible grip had vanished, but her skin burned where it had clutched her. Ben cursed, his voice low and shaky. "What the hell is this place?" No one answered. Emma slowly lifted her flashlight, casting its weak glow around the chamber. It was smaller than the hallway, circular, with walls of smooth stone etched with faint markings. Strange symbols, curling and jagged, spiraled across the surface, glowing faintly as if alive. In the center of the room stood a pedestal. Upon it, a book lay open, its pages yellowed and curling with age. Jake swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't touch it." But the house had other plans. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and ash. The symbols along the walls pulsed, faintly at first, then with steady rhythm, like the beating of a heart. Emma's flashlight flickered again before dying completely, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the glow of the markings and the faint shimmer from the book. Lily took a hesitant step forward, drawn as though by unseen threads. "Wants us to read it," she whispered, her voice trance-like. "No," Jake snapped, grabbing her arm, but Lily's eyes were glazed, her body trembling as she stared at the open pages. The others felt it, too, a pull, deep and insistent, burrowing into their minds. The words on the page seemed to writhe, letters crawling like insects, reshaping themselves into a language none of them had seen before, and yet somehow they understood. Emma shook her head, forcing her gaze away. Her voice cracked with desperation. "Don't read it, Lily, please." But Lily's lips were already moving, her voice quiet and shaking as she whispered the first line aloud. The words spilled into the air, harsh and jagged, and the room responded. The markings along the walls blazed brighter, the ground trembling beneath their feet. A low moan echoed, not from the walls, not from the ceiling, but from the very air itself. The mansion groaned, alive and furious. The shadows returned, seeping in from the corners of the chamber, twisting upward like smoke made solid. The figures they had fled from in the hallway were back, stronger, clearer, their faces no longer blank, but eerily familiar. Emma's blood ran cold. They were looking at themselves, for yet Shadow had transformed fully into their likeness, perfect copies, except for the eyes, which burned with a hollow white light. And they smiled. The door slammed. Shut behind them, they were trapped. The shadows waited, silent, yet somehow heavy, pressing down upon the four friends like an unseen weight. Emma's legs refused to move, glued to the cold stone floor, while Jake's grip on the flashlight was tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Ben had raised his crowbar again, though the metal seemed absurdly weak against the presence before them. Lily, still whispering fragments of the strange incantation, seemed lost to herself, her body swaying as though tethered to the book on the pedestal. The room had changed. The circular stone chamber, once quiet save for the soft glow of its runes, now pulsed with life. The markings writhed across the walls, shifting like molten metal, expanding and contracting in rhythm with a low, resonant hum that penetrated their bones. The sound was not in the air, it was in them, vibrating deep inside, echoing in the chest, making each heartbeat thunder in unison with the room. Emma's voice broke first, thin and trembling. What are they? The shadows responded, in kind, not with words, but with motion. They stepped forward, gliding silently across the floor, the white light of their eyes fixed on each friend in turn. Then they stopped, halting several feet away, mirroring their counterparts' positions in the real world. It's us, whispered Lily, finally lifting her gaze from the pedestal. Her voice was shaky, distant, almost dreamlike, but wrong. Something wrong. Ben's mouth opened, but no words came. His crowbar trembled in his hand, as though it could sense the futility of resistance. Jake swallowed hard, finally breaking the paralysis that had held him. He took a tentative step forward. Why are you here? No answer came. Only the humming intensified, vibrating through the floor and walls and into their minds. Then a single, deliberate movement. The doppelganger of Emma lifted its hand, stretching long, thin fingers toward her. She stumbled back involuntarily, tripping over her own feet, and Jake grabbed her arm, steadying her. The air thickened, heavy, with tension. Yet it was not just fear. They felt something else. Recognition. The shadows were mimicking them, but in a way that suggested consciousness. They weren't merely reflections. They were aware. Lily's whispering grew louder, and the words became more coherent, though not in any language they had learned. The sound seemed to bend reality itself. The walls quivered in response, and the runes along the stone glowed brighter, hotter. The pedestal book quivered, pages flipping of their own accord. Emma, shaken, shouted at her friend, "Stop it! Stop reading!" But Lily was beyond hearing. Her eyes had rolled back slightly, revealing a white haze that shimmered in the glow of the symbols. The shadows, as if drawn by the words, stepped closer. Their movements were fluid, unnatural, bending the space between them and the friends. The first strike came without warning. A shadow, Ben's double, lunged forward, but passed straight through him. The air around Ben sizzled, as though struck by electricity, and he stumbled back, staggering. The sensation left him gasping, limbs trembling. Jake grabbed Emma and dragged her behind him as he shouted, "We have to leave, now!" But the chamber seemed infinite. Every turn, Every step led them deeper into the same circular room, though the walls and floor shifted and pulsed. The door they had entered through vanished, replaced by more of the glowing runes. Panic surged. Emma's flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, the shadows were everywhere, moving closer, their forms shifting, becoming taller, more menacing. Jake fumbled in his backpack and produced a lighter, its flame trembling in the draftless room. The small flicker of light revealed their doppelgangers' expressions, malicious, twisted, predatory. One by one, the shadows moved in unison, raising their hands. The book on the pedestal glowed violently, pages turning faster, and the symbols along the walls began to crawl upward like liquid. The hum became a roar inside their heads, threatening to tear their minds apart. "Lily," Jake screamed. "Shut it! Close the book!" But Lily, now seemingly possessed by something else entirely, did not respond. The incantation poured from her lips in a cadence that made the chamber itself warp and pulse. The runes now glowed with a violent crimson, casting long, writhing shadows that danced across the friends' faces. Suddenly, a sharp wind surged through the chamber, slamming Emma into the wall. Dust and small pebbles swirled around them, and the shadows lurched forward, merging with the runes along the walls. The room seemed to fold in on itself. The circular stone of the chamber elongated into an endless corridor, lined with spectral doors. Jake's grip on the lighter tightened, its flame quivering. "We have to stick together," he said, voice low and firm despite the panic gnawing at him. No one goes alone. They moved as one, stepping cautiously along the hallway that had appeared from nowhere. The shadows followed at a distance, flickering in and out of visibility, their presence heavy, pressing against the edges of the friends' consciousness. Each door along the corridor beckoned them with faint whispers, echoing thoughts they dared not think. Emma's stomach churned as she heard faint laughter, soft and childlike, coming from behind one door. Her hands flew to her ears. Don't let it in your head." But it was too late. The house knew what each of them feared most, and each step along the corridor drew those fears into sharper focus. Jake glimpsed a door with his own face etched into it, screaming silently, eyes wide with terror. He recoiled, stumbling into Ben, who had frozen as an image of his childhood home, flickered behind another doorway, burning, crumbling flames. Licking at the walls, they pressed forward, forcing themselves past the doors that seemed to call them, whispering their names in tones only they could hear. Then came the sound, a metallic scraping, low and deliberate. Something was moving behind them again, faster now, closer. The shadows were not simply following, they were hunting. Emma's hand found Jake's arm. "We have to split up," she said, though her voice wavered. "We can't." "No," Jake interrupted, voice urgent. "Together. Always together. If we split, they'll pick us off, one by one." The friends pressed onward, the corridor stretching endlessly, the doors multiplying at each step. Their lungs burned, their legs ached, but the fear that clawed at their minds pushed them forward with relentless determination. Then, at the far end of the corridor, a faint light shimmered, a soft, golden glow. Unlike the crimson pulse of the runes, it felt warm, inviting, almost alive in a comforting way. They hesitated, staring at it as though drawn to salvation. As they approached, the shadows faltered, lingering at the edge of the corridor, writhing and twisting. The light at the end of the passage grew stronger, illuminating a small room beyond. A door, simple and wooden, marked the only exit from the corridor. Relief surged through them, but it was tempered with caution. Ben spoke first, voice shaking. It could be another trick. Jake nodded. "We don't have a choice. We go together." They reached the door, and as Jake grasped the handle, a sound cut through the chamber like a blade, the book's pages flipping violently, the runes, along the corridor, glowing red with renewed fury. The shadows hissed and surged forward, moving faster than ever, their forms stretching and twisting in impossible ways. Emma screamed as a shadow lunged at her, but it collided with the golden light spilling from the doorway, melting into a wisp of smoke and vanishing. One by one, the others tried to reach them, only to recoil at the edge of the light, their forms dissipating like ink in water. With one final push, Jake swung the door open. The four friends tumbled through, falling onto cold stone beyond the mansion, landing in a grove of trees illuminated by moonlight. The whispers were gone, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. They lay there for a moment, gasping, shivering, too exhausted to speak. Around them, the forest stretched infinitely, quiet and still, the horrors of the mansion unable to follow. Lily's hands shook as she closed her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. Emma reached out and took her hand. "I think, for now." Ben groaned, sitting up slowly. "We survived, somehow." Jake looked back toward the darkness of the mansion. Even at a distance, the structure seemed wrong. Its silhouette bending against the natural curves of the trees, impossible angles that shouldn't exist. Something inside that house still waited, something patient, waiting for its next chance. And though they were free, they knew the truth. The mansion had changed them. The shadows, the whispers, the chamber of echoes, they were not gone. Not entirely. Something had followed them, something subtle, a lingering presence just beyond perception, waiting for the moment when fear would return, when the mind would falter, when the mansion would call again. The four friends rose together, supporting each other as they moved through the forest, toward the faint glimmer of dawn breaking over the horizon. But even as the sun rose, painting the world with light, none of them spoke. They knew the story of the mansion, of the shadows, of the doppelgangers was far from over. It was a beginning, a warning, and the echoes of that night would haunt them forever. They walked onward, silent and wary, knowing that wherever the mansion existed, and it existed beyond maps and reason, it would wait, and they would never truly escape its gaze. The forest seemed endless, each tree a silent sentinel, its branches like skeletal fingers stretching toward the pale morning sky. Emma's lungs burned, not just from the run, but from the tension that had gripped her since they fled the mansion. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig beneath their feet, sent a shiver racing down her spine. Jake led the way. Flashlight now a faint afterthought against the creeping dawn. He glanced back at his friends, noting the exhaustion etched into their faces. Ben's eyes darted constantly, scanning the shadows, while Lily's hands trembled, her fingers absently tracing the air, as though the echoes of the mansion were still present in her movements. "It's too quiet," Emma whispered. Her voice trembled as she tried to steady herself. "I can feel it watching us." Jake nodded but said nothing. He had felt it too. The subtle weight that pressed upon them, something unseen but unmistakably present. Something that had followed them out of the mansion, something patient and calculating. The forest opened slightly, revealing a narrow path that seemed almost carved by intention. Moss covered the ground, thick and damp, muffling their steps. The morning fog clung low, curling around the trunks like smoke. Emma shivered despite the exertion, hugging herself tightly. "Do you think it's gone?" Ben asked, voice low, almost pleading. Lily, eyes still clouded with residual trance from the mansion, shook her head. "No, it never leaves. Not truly. The mansion. It leaves a mark." They pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last. The path wound between gnarled oaks and twisted pines, the forest growing denser, darker, despite the daylight trying to filter through the canopy. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that defied logic. Then came the sound, soft, deliberate footsteps echoing somewhere behind them. Emma froze. "There it is," she breathed. "It's following us." Jake spun, sweeping the flashlight backward. The beam cut through the fog but revealed nothing, only the swaying trees, the mist curling between the trunks, and the faint glimmer of dew on leaves. Still, the feeling of being observed intensified, prickling their skin, crawling under their scalps. "Keep moving," Jake urged. "No stopping." They quickened their pace, hearts pounding, boots squelching in the damp moss. The footsteps followed, perfectly timed with theirs, yet silent. Only the occasional rustle of underbrush hinted at its presence. A sudden crack made them jump, a branch snapping under weight, or perhaps under something else. Ben raised the crowbar again. "Show yourself," he barked, voice cracking. Silence answered him, but the pressure in the air grew, thickening like water. Lily clutched her head, eyes squeezed shut. "It's thinking," she murmured, voice barely audible. "It knows our fear. It feeds on it." Emma looked at her in horror. "What do you mean it feeds on fear?" But Lily did not answer. Instead, she whispered the strange incantation. Again, fragments of the mansion spilling involuntarily from her lips. The forest seemed to react. The fog shifted, curling tighter around their legs, and the trees groaned softly, bending as though listening. A shadow moved at the edge of their vision. Not a human shape, something taller, elongated, impossible. Its eyes glowed faintly amber, reflecting the limited light in the forest. It did not approach yet. It simply watched, waiting. Jake swallowed, voice low. "We can't outrun it. We have to confront it. We have to know what it wants." Emma shook her head, tears forming. "Confront it? Jake, we barely made it out of that mansion alive." "I know," he said, jaw tight. "But we can't run forever. It's following us, testing us. If we stop, we'll give it power. If we fight, maybe we can end this." The group pressed forward, following the narrow path until it opened onto a small clearing. The fog hung low, clinging to the ground, and at the center of the clearing, a stone altar stood. The moss-covered surface was ancient, etched with symbols that mirrored those in the mansion. The shadows converged there, subtle at first, then clearer. One by one, they took shape, elongated figures, indistinct but humanoid, their amber eyes glowing steadily. And in the center, the largest figure stepped forward, taller than the rest, its form more defined, draped in black mist. Jake's breath caught. "The Watcher," he whispered. The being's presence pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching unnaturally. The watcher did not speak. It did not move closer. It simply observed, as if weighing their worth, measuring their fear, deciding their fate. Lily stepped forward, trembling, her voice rising in the strange chant. The words felt alive, curling around the clearing like smoke. The watcher's form shivered at her incantation, and the smaller shadows writhed, retreating slightly. Emma grabbed her friend's arm. "Stop! You're drawing it closer, Lily." But Lily could not stop. Her voice grew stronger, more confident, though the strain was evident. The symbols on the stone altar pulsed faintly, and the air seemed to hum with energy. The watcher's amber eyes flared, and a deep resonant sound filled the clearing. It was not a voice, not a roar, but a vibration that sank into the chest, rattling teeth and bones alike. The friends staggered, holding on to each other for balance. Ben shouted over the hum, "We're not backing down, not this time." He swung the crowbar toward the watcher. Though it passed harmlessly through the figure, his strike leaving a ripple of energy that shimmered in the air. The watcher recoiled slightly, almost acknowledging the defiance, then lifted a hand. The shadows behind it surged, twisting and stretching toward the group. Jake stepped in front, raising his flashlight like a weapon. The light cut through the mist, illuminating the figures with stark clarity. For the first time, they could see the features of the watcher, angular, almost crystalline, faceless, except for those glowing amber eyes. Its form seemed solid, yet fluid, shifting in ways that no mortal body could. Emma's voice broke. "How do we stop it?" The watcher's presence pressed inward, a mental weight that whispered their fears, their regrets, their deepest vulnerabilities. Jake felt it probing, testing the limits of his mind. And then, as if answering an unspoken question, Lily raised the book again. The ancient text hovered in her hands, pages glowing, pulsating with a light that pushed against the shadows. Watcher hissed, a sound like metal grinding against stone, and the shadows recoiled further. The clearing erupted in a chaotic clash of energy, the air thick with pressure, charged with an otherworldly power. "Together," Jake shouted. "We hold it back, all of us." Emma, Ben, and Lily joined hands, forming a circle around the book. The words Lily spoke became more coherent, more powerful. The light from the altar and the book merged, creating a barrier of energy that pressed against the shadows. The watcher advanced, but the light pushed back, creating a stalemate. Its amber eyes blazed, and for a moment it seemed almost human, its form flickering, showing glimpses of a face, distorted and pained, and then the air changed. The forest fell silent. The wind stopped. The mist froze in place. The watcher raised its hand, and the ground beneath it cracked, fissures spreading outward like a spider web. A final hiss reverberated through the clearing, sharp and high-pitched, and then it was gone, vanished into the mist, leaving behind only silence. The shadows dissolved, evaporating into the morning light, and the book's glow dimmed, leaving the altar cold and ancient once more. Emma collapsed to her knees, gasping. Ben slumped beside her, shaking uncontrollably. Lily's hands fell to her sides, the book slipping from her grasp. Jake stood at the center of the clearing, flashlight trembling, chest heaving. "It's over. For now," he whispered, though doubt lingered in his voice. The friends huddled, together, staring at the forest around them. The trees were still, the fog beginning to lift, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the canopy. They had survived, yet they all knew the truth. The Watcher was not gone forever. It had observed, learned, and waited, and somewhere, in the darkness beyond the forest, the mansion still stood, its corridors and chambers untouched by time, its shadows alive, waiting for the next intrusion. As they made their way through the forest, the whispers returned, not the chanting of Lily, not the voices of the mansion, but subtle, soft, almost inaudible, a reminder that the Watcher and the chamber it guarded was always watching, always waiting, always patient. The forest seemed alive with secrets, and the friends walked silently, each step carrying the weight of the night's terror, each breath, a reminder that some shadows never truly fade. The mansion, the Watcher, the doppelgangers, they were not just memories, they were a part of them now, stitched into the very fabric of their minds, and no dawn, no light, could erase them. They emerged from the woods as the sun rose fully, painting the world in gold and warmth. But even in the brilliance of daylight, the forest behind them held a lingering darkness, a promise that the shadows were never far away, and that the Watcher would return when the time was right. The night returned faster than any of them expected. Despite the sun rising hours ago, the forest seemed to breathe in darkness, shadows curling into corners and pooling beneath trees like spilled ink. The road out of the forest led them toward the town on the edge of the clearing, but no comfort awaited them there. The streets were empty, the houses dark and silent as if the world itself had been suspended. Emma walked close to Jake, holding his hand tightly, as though physical contact could tether her to reality. Her eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, searching for something unseen. Ben carried the crowbar loosely, the weight a small comfort in his trembling hands. Lily, though quiet, clutched the book she had dropped in the clearing earlier, its edges glowing faintly even in daylight, pulsing as though alive. "Something isn't right," Jake murmured, voice tight with unease. "Even outside the forest, it's like the shadows followed us." Emma nodded. "I feel it. It's waiting." They moved slowly, alert to every sound, the soft scuff of their shoes, the distant call of a bird, the wind shifting in patterns that felt deliberate. At the edge of the town, the streetlights flickered for a moment, plunging them into a dim twilight before returning to their weak glow. "You don't think it can leave the forest, do you?" Ben asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head. "I don't know, but it can reach us." The mansion loomed in their thoughts, like a wound that refused to heal. Every brick, every cracked window, every shadowed hallway had been imprinted on their memories. The Watcher, the doppelgangers, the shifting walls, they were not bound to the mansion alone. That place was only a focal point, a thin seam between what was real and what was not, and the Watcher, they realized, could exist anywhere it wished. As they approached the abandoned train station at the edge of town, a sudden chill ran through the air. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath misting in front of them. Emma zoomed, hair lifted slightly, as if the air itself was charged. Lily clutched the book to her chest, sensing the change before any of the others did. "It's here," she whispered. Before anyone could respond, a figure stepped from the shadows. Not the Watcher. They would have recognized that form. But another presence, tall, thin, entirely black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The figure moved with deliberate slowness, its steps silent. Every instinct screamed for them to run, but their legs refused. They were frozen, caught between fear and fascination. "Show yourself," Jake said, his voice steady, despite the quiver in his chest. "We're not afraid of you." The figure tilted its head, considering, before slowly dissolving into the fog that had begun to creep along the streets. The mist coiled around the edges of buildings, crawling along the ground like liquid shadow. Then came the whispers, soft, almost indecipherable, voices overlapping, some familiar, some alien. They seemed to speak directly into the mind, words forming images more than sentences, warnings, memories, glimpses of places they had never seen. Ben stumbled backward, clutching his head. It's inside my mind." Lily lifted the book, the glow now stronger, illuminating strange symbols that danced along the pages. The whispers recoiled slightly from the light, but they did not stop. The voices pressed, filling the empty streets, echoing from the walls and the cracked windows. Emma's stomach dropped. She realized the mansion's influence extended beyond physical space. It had imprinted itself onto them, leaving a psychic trail that the shadows could follow. Every fear, every memory of terror, every suppressed scream gave the entities shape and form. "We have to go back," Jake said firmly. "The mansion, it's the source, the watcher, everything that's happening. It's tied to that place. We need to finish this once and for all." "Are you insane?" Emma asked. "We barely escaped. That thing—" Jake shook his head. "We can't run forever. If we leave it unchecked, it will only grow stronger. We have to confront it on its own ground." The friends exchanged fearful glances. Even Ben, who had always been the brave one, seemed hesitant, but they understood the truth. There was no escaping this, not without facing the source directly. Nightfall returned quickly. The journey back to the mansion was unnerving. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the landscape, bending and twisting, as if alive. The fog rolled along the ground, curling around their ankles, and every tree became a potential hiding place for unseen watchers. The world felt distorted, as though the forest itself had grown hungry and waited for them. When they reached the mansion, it loomed like a living entity. The walls were darkened, the windows reflecting no light, absorbing the moon's glow. Every door, every crack, every archway seemed to pulse faintly, like the heartbeat of the building itself. "This place, it's alive," Lily whispered. "It's aware of us. It remembers us." Jake nodded. "Then we use that. We confront it on its own terms." They entered cautiously. The front doors groaned, the hinges resisting their intrusion, as if the mansion itself sought to warn them. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust, decay, and something metallic, something alive. The shadows danced across the walls, stretching into forms that reminded them of the Watcher, of doppelgangers, of long-forgotten memories. The friends moved slowly through the halls, following the faint glow of the symbols Lily had traced in the book. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, as if the mansion exhaled in anticipation. Whispered voices echoed down corridors, low and melodic, shifting into unrecognizable patterns that caused their minds to strain in understanding. A sudden movement made them jump, a shadow that wasn't theirs, moving independently across the wall. It stretched and bent, forming shapes both human and inhuman. Then it disappeared, leaving only the faint sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. At the center of the mansion, they found the grand hall, untouched by time in its grandeur, but darkened by a palpable malevolence. The air was thick here, electric with tension, and the floor seemed to pulse faintly beneath their feet. The walls bore markings not seen before, etched symbols, eyes, geometric patterns, all glowing faintly as if responding to their presence. "The heart of it," Lily said softly. "This is where it resides." The Watcher appeared then, its form stepping from the shadows of the hall. Taller, more defined than before, its amber eyes glowing with an intensity that made their bones ache. Behind it, the shadows stretched and writhed, forming a dark ocean that threatened to consume the entire room. Emma felt a cold pressure against her chest, her heartbeat hammering. The Watcher did not move toward them, but exuded a presence that pressed inward, filling every corner of the hall, pressing against their minds. Images flashed in her thoughts. The mansion alive, corridors stretching impossibly, creatures crawling along walls, faces of the Watcher everywhere. Jake raised the flashlight, pointing it directly at the entity. "We're not afraid," he shouted, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The Watcher tilted its head, and a deep vibration rolled through the hall. The shadows behind it surged forward, but Lily raised the book, the light flaring brighter, forcing the shadows back. The symbols on the walls glowed, reacting to her incantations. Ben and Emma joined hands, focusing their fear into determination. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but the light from the book and the symbols pushed back, creating a protective bubble around the group. The Watcher hissed, a sound that was felt more than heard. Its form flickered, showing glimpses of faces, limbs, impossible geometries. The shadows began to pulse and twist, and the mansion itself seemed to writhe, its walls stretching and contracting in response to the struggle. Lily's voice rose, chanting the words with growing strength. The light from the book became blinding, illuminating the hall in pure white brilliance. The shadows recoiled violently, shrieking in a soundless scream that echoed in their minds. Emma felt the mansion's presence pressing against her, trying to pull her into the walls, into the shadows, into the very floor. She screamed, resisting, feeling the cold tendrils brush against her skin. Jake grabbed her, grounding her, focusing on the light, on the strength of their unity. The Watcher surged forward, reaching toward them with a hand of shadow, but the light struck it, and it recoiled, hissing in fury. Amber eyes burned with anger, its form flickering, dissolving slightly at the edges. "Hold on," Jake shouted. "Keep it together. We can end this." The shadows writhed, screaming in silence, the mansion shuddering as if alive. The light from the book and the symbols pushed further, brighter, until the entire hall was bathed in energy that seemed to burn through the fabric of the mansion itself. Then, as suddenly as it began, the light contracted, the shadows collapsed, and the Watcher let out one final, resonant hiss. Its form dissipated into the air, leaving only a faint shimmer in the hall. The mansion shivered once, then fell silent, still, empty. The friends collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily, exhausted, yet alive. The hall was empty, the air clear for the first time in weeks. The mansion's heartbeat had slowed, the malevolence gone, leaving only the echo of what had been. For a long while, none of them spoke. They simply sat, taking in the silence, the stillness, the relief. But deep in their minds, the truth lingered. They had won this battle, but the war was never truly over. The mansion, the Watcher, the shadows, they were a part of the world, patient, watching, waiting for the next intruders. And somewhere, beyond the hall, beyond the walls, the book lay faintly glowing, its pulse a reminder that knowledge was power, and that some power was better left untouched. If you want, I can continue with Scene 14 and Scene 15, bringing the story to its final terrifying climax and resolution, keeping the slow, suspenseful, and atmospheric tone consistent. The mansion no longer pulsed with life, but the memory of its presence hung in the air like a fog that refused to lift. Emma, Jake, Ben, and Lily sat in the grand hall, exhausted and trembling, yet unable to leave. The glow from the book had dimmed, leaving only faint traces of light along its edges. Even though the watcher had disappeared, the silence that followed felt heavier than the darkness ever had. "It's not over," Lily whispered, voice barely audible. Her fingers traced the embossed symbols on the book's cover, as if seeking reassurance. "It's just hiding, waiting," Jake nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "It won't come back here, not while we're prepared. But the moment we let our guard down, it could strike anywhere." Ben shivered, realizing that the mansion had left something behind. An echo, a ripple of its influence that had latched onto their minds. "I can still feel it," he admitted, voice low, like it's watching from a distance. Emma stood slowly, her body aching, her chest tight with a lingering panic. "We need answers," she said firmly. "We survived this, but why? And why us?" The others looked at her, uncertainty mirrored in their eyes. The mansion had tested them, shaped their fears, and yet they had survived. But survival was not understanding. It was not clarity. And the questions remained, gnawing at the edges of their consciousness. They left the hall cautiously, stepping into the corridor where shadows still lingered in corners, thin and wavering, as if hesitant to retreat completely. The walls seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally, a residual echo of the mansion's power. The air was thick and musty, carrying whispers that were faint but insistent. Lily opened the book again, hoping for guidance, for some key to understanding. The strange symbols, the incantations, and the mansion itself. The pages now pulsed faintly with a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Symbols shifted, revealing new formations that had not been there before. "It's reacting to us," Lily murmured, tracing a pattern along the page with her finger. "It's alive in its own way. The book is like a part of the mansion, like a fragment of its mind." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. If it's part of the mansion, then does that mean it can't leave? That it's bound here? Dwa shook her head slowly. Maybe. Or maybe it's just patient. It can wait for us to let our guard down, to wander somewhere else where it has more freedom. This book, it's a warning, not just a tool. It's saying, remember. Never forget. "What happens here?" Jake clenched his fists, anger mixing with fear. "Then we make sure we don't forget. And we make sure it doesn't get another chance." The air around them shifted suddenly, colder, denser, like a physical pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The mansion's heartbeat returned in a faint, slow pulse, resonating through the floor, the walls, even the very air. Shadows lengthened and thickened, merging into shapes that were almost tangible. And then the watcher returned, not the same as before, but altered, stronger, more defined, almost impervious to the light from the book. Amber eyes burned with intensity. Black voids of shadow twisting around its form. Jake shouted, "Back to the hall! Use the book!" They ran, the floor beneath their feet groaning, stretching like taffy, the walls bending in impossible ways. The mansion itself seemed to resist them, corridors twisting and elongating, doors vanishing and reappearing, creating a labyrinth that sought to trap them. The Watcher moved silently, gliding through the warped corridors, its eyes never leaving them. Emma could feel it in her bones. The mansion and the Watcher were one entity now, a single intelligence that had been watching, learning, and adapting to their resistance. When they reached the grand hall, Lily raised the book, chanting in the rhythm she had learned, her voice trembling but firm. Symbols on the walls flared, glowing with a light that pushed back the encroaching shadows. The Watcher hissed, a sound that vibrated in their minds, sending waves of terror through their bodies. Ben and Jake joined hands with Emma, forming a circle around Lily, focusing their fear into determination. The mansion resisted, walls bending, floorboards twisting, shadows forming limbs and faces, all converging toward the center of the hall. "You can't keep us here," Jake shouted. "We're not yours." The Watcher paused, tilting its head, studying them with an intelligence that was alien, ancient, and terrifying. Then it surged forward, a wave of darkness that swallowed the light from the book. The friends were tossed back, sliding across the floor, the shadows pressing against them like liquid, freezing their movements. Emma felt a presence inside her mind, probing, whispering images she could barely comprehend. Memories of other intruders, screams trapped in the walls, faces contorted in terror, corridors that never ended. The mansion itself seemed alive in a way she had never imagined, sentient, cruel, patient. Lily screamed, her voice rising above the whispers, and the book flared brighter, pushing against the darkness. Symbols on the walls shifted, forming new constellations, intricate and impossible, mapping out the mansion's true structure. The Watcher recoiled slightly, hissing in fury, the amber glow in its eyes flickering as the light struck it. Jake rose, holding Emma's hand tightly. "We're not afraid. Together we end this." The mansion shuddered violently, as if resisting their unity. The shadows twisted and pulsed, the floor rippling beneath them. A deafening silence fell for a moment, broken only by the whispering of the mansion itself. Then the Watcher screamed, a high, resonant sound that seemed to pierce through reality, a sound of pure rage and fear intertwined. Emma realized then that the mansion had a weakness, its reliance on fear, on despair, on division. The moment they faced it together, united in determination, the entity's power weakened. "Now," Lily shouted. The book flared with blinding intensity, the symbols forming a spiral of light that reached into the ceiling, the walls, and even into the floor. The Watcher shrieked, its form flickering, losing cohesion. Amber eyes burned, then dimmed. Shadows recoiled violently, retreating into corners, into cracks, into the very walls themselves. Emma, Jake, Ben, and Lily felt the mansion's pulse slowing, the oppressive pressure lifting, the air clearing for the first time in hours. The Watcher's form disintegrated, leaving only a ripple in the hall, a faint shimmer that dissolved into nothingness. For a long moment, there was silence. The mansion seemed empty, inert, almost peaceful. But the friends knew better. They had survived. but they had glimpsed something ancient, powerful, and patient. The mansion would wait. The shadows would wait. And somewhere, in some other corner of the world, the Watcher, or something like it, would watch and wait again. They left the mansion carefully, stepping into the first light of dawn. The fog lingered in the forest, but it felt less threatening, less alive. The town at the edge of the clearing remained eerily silent, but the oppressive weight had lifted. Birds began to sing, a tentative reassurance that the world was still normal for now. Emma glanced back at the mansion, its dark silhouette, framed against the rising sun. "We did it," she whispered. "We survived." Jake nodded, but his eyes were wary. "Yes, but we can't forget. Not ever. Whatever was in there, it can return, and next time, it might be stronger." Lily closed the book, the glow fading. "We'll be ready," she said. "We've learned its patterns, its weaknesses, and we've survived." Ben looked at the forest, at the winding path they had traveled. Some things shouldn't exist, but if they do, we'll face them. They walked back toward the world of sunlight. The mansion receded into the distance, a dark sentinel at the edge of memory. The forest was silent now, but the shadows lingered just beyond the edges of vision, watching, waiting, and far away where no one could see, a single amber eye opened in the darkness. A whisper traveled through the air, faint but unmistakable. "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." The friends did not hear it. They could not. But the world had changed, subtly, permanently. The mansion, the Watcher, and the shadows had left their mark, and the knowledge of what lay beyond would never fade. For the first time the forest was quiet. For the first time the mansion was still, but somewhere deep within the shadows, patience endured, and the Watcher waited, unblinking, eternal, and always hungry.